So we are in the playoff season of that weird sport that we play here in America called football, despite the fact that the foot rarely touches the ball. And that has led to the typical complaints after every game about bad calls and missed officiating. I'll tell you the truth. I'm not a real big fan of sport, but I do consider myself somewhat of an expert on complaining about officials because I have lifelong experience with an elite practitioner of that particular activity. My older brother is perhaps one of the greatest referee complainers that has ever lived. To my knowledge, he originated the gem, "Did you lose your eyesight when you lost your hair?" which was shouted so loudly at a professional basketball game in the 1990s that it could be heard clearly on television, and to the referee's credit, he even laughed. And in my brother's defense, that referee maybe could have chosen to referee an outside sport where they at least would have given him a hat. But the thing is, even if you don't much care about sport, you should care about sports officiating, because fairness counts in sports. It's important. The fact is, in most of life, life is simply not fair. It's not. And there's not much that we can do about that. And sports is just one place where we should be able to guarantee an even playing field. And our attempts to do that deserve to be remembered. It is possible that some version of organized sport predates civilization, with some cave paintings in the Lascaux caves dated to the Upper Paleolithic implying wrestling competitions. In fact, Michelle Scalise Sugimaya of the University of Oregon argued, based on an ethnographic study of hunter-gatherer societies published in a 2012 edition of the journal Evolutionary Psychology, that sport is so common in such societies that it suggests that the motivation to engage in them is a universal feature of human psychology. However, these sports tend to be more self-regulating. While engagement in some version of sport seems universal and might serve important cultural needs, the idea of an impartial arbiter seems to have come later. Organized sports have an ancient origin, with references in Egypt dating back some 5,800 years. Independent scholar Doa El-Sharif explains in a 2020 edition of World History Bulletin that relief scenes in Egyptian temples and tombs portray a number of sports played at least as far back as the pre-dynastic period, including hunting, fishing, boxing, javelin throwing, wrestling, gymnastics, weightlifting, and rowing, and team sports that included versions of hockey and tug-of-war. These sports had apparently developed rules and thus referees. Sharif writes, thousands of years ago, ancient Egyptians laid down the basic rules for competitive games. They chose neutral referees, uniforms for each team in multiplayer games, and celebrated winners by dressing them with different necklaces. Likewise, ancient Greeks included referees, which were called the Hellenodikoi, in their ancient Olympic Games, traditionally dated to have originated in 776 BC. The term translates as the judges of the Greeks. In ancient Rome, gladiatorial games were refereed by former gladiators who had won their freedom via success in the arena. Symbolically, such men were given a wooden sword that was called a rudis, that represented proof that they had won their freedom. Thus, such men, when engaged as referees enforcing rules in the arena, were called rudis, and were either generally a summa rudis, meaning senior referee, or a secunda rudis, or assistant. Latinist N.S. Gill explains in an article on ThoughtCo last April that these officials were identified by their white tunics and carried batons and whips, which was, they pointed out, illegal movements. According to Gill, rudis could earn fame and wealth as game officials, and some are identified by name in ancient inscriptions. However, sports historian Michael Juncker notes on a blog on the website of the Swiss National Museum that spectators and the emperor got to decide who won and who lost, so the outcome was not necessarily a neutral decision. But did such referees make bad calls? The website OlympicLegacy.com opines that throughout the ages, the Olympic judges were renowned for their fairness. The Heliodikoi were required to swear an oath to make a fair judgment and not to take bribes. However, an oath only goes so far. The 2nd century AD Roman historian Cassius Dio records that in 67 AD, Roman Emperor Nero bribed the Heliodikoi with 1,000,000 sesterces and Roman citizenship in exchange for declaring him the winner of several contests, including a chariot race that he didn't even finish. Although the website Ancient Origins notes that there may have been a further incentive. Of course, the judges were probably put in a bind, because if they rejected the bribe, they may have risked losing their lives. Likewise, the Greek chronicler Pausanias noted an instance where a judge was accused of corruption in adjudicating the winner of a foot race, leading to disputes over the result, and another where a judge was allowed to win a contest in which he was both a participant and judge. That is to say, there were ancient Romans and Greeks arguing that the fix was in at least some 1900 years ago, just like we still do today, though they would have done so in Latin. Referees were also an important part of medieval sport, especially martial sports like chivalrous tournaments, where Duker notes that knights who did not behave in a chivalrous manner could be fined or even disqualified from a tournament by heralds in charge of enforcing rules and determining winners. Part of the goal was to prevent fatalities, as Duker notes. Apart from everything else, the church had banned this type of combat and could refuse a Christian burial for anyone who were killed. Still, he writes, there are hardly any records from the Middle Ages referring to arbiters or referees as biased or corruptible, and therefore not to be trusted. But there were some. For example, in a contemporary account of a 6-day tournament held in the French village of Chauvency in 1285, poet Jacques Bretel describes the heralds in charge of enforcing the rules as squawking like a flock of crows, and writes that not even the biblical king Herod, the embodiment of greed, was 100th part as grasping as a herald, out to grab what they can, saying a curse on the lot of them, always on the take, giving not a thing, and full of lies and pomposity. Duker concludes, despite the paucity of research and documentary evidence, it's safe to assume that referees in the Middle Ages were also only human, and it's entirely feasible that they were influenced to some extent. The idea of a referee can be seen in the term umpire, which was first coined in the late Middle Ages. According to Etymology Online, the term is derived from the Old French non per, meaning an odd number, not even, in reference to a third person to arbitrate between two people. But there is special meaning there, as the term literally means not equal, suggesting a decision maker who is above the others. However, the term was first used as part of legal proceedings, and Etymology Online writes its use in the gaming sense was not recorded until 1714. The judge being not equal could be literal. Monarchs acted as judges, part of the divine rights of kings, and this may, however, result in a conflict of interest. In an account from 1026, English King Canute the Great made an illegal move in chess, and essentially as king arbiter, changed the rule in his favor. When his opponent, the Earl Ulf, objected too loudly, Canute had him killed. Duker argues as sports became more regulated, the need for an impartial referee became more important. In his 1581 publication, Positions wherein these primitive circumstances be examined, which are necessary for the training up of children, English educator Richard Mulcaster argued both for more defined rules of the game of football, a term that he may have coined, and which we Americans of course call soccer, but for a referee. For if one stand by, which can judge of the play, and is judge over the parties, and hath authority to command in the place, all those inconveniences have been, I know, and will be, I am sure, very lightly redressed. Nay, they will never intermeddle in the matter, neither shall there be complaint, where there is no cause. Were he to read a modern sports blog, he might revise his assessment that a referee will eliminate complaints. And there's little evidence that his call in the 16th century for soccer referees was immediately heeded. Jucker writes, for example, that the first football rules were established in Switzerland in 1863, and a referee was introduced to the game in 1874. 4 years later, he writes, the referee was given a whistle. Mike Higgins of the University of Cumbria wrote in a 2023 edition of the International Journal of the History of Sport that referees began to be used in sports such as pugilism from the early 19th century, and after the Queensberry rules were introduced later in the century, there was an increasing emphasis on the appointment of experienced amateur referees. When the modern forms of soccer and rugby emerged, they followed the same stages, beginning with joint agreement by the two sides, then one umpire for each side, the introduction of a neutral referee as their national authorities gained in power, and finally a new step, with two umpires becoming linesmen. In London, referee societies for both association football and for rugby were first established in 1893. Over the course of the 19th century, professional organizations arose in numerous sports, establishing authority and codifying rules, but controversies continued. In 1896, the heavyweight boxing championship between Bob Fitzsimmons and Tom Sharkey was marred by the referee's decision to award the match to Sharkey after Fitzsimmons knocked him to the mat. The referee contended in a controversial call that Fitzsimmons had hit Sharkey below the belt, a violation of the Queensberry rules. And the crowd was disgusted and accused the referee of being corrupt. It was a surprising result, since promoters had chosen the famous Western lawman Wyatt Earp to referee the match, under the impression that his reputation would prevent such scandals. Football, the European kind, is a game where referees can have a significant impact on a game, and professional sport has been rocked with numerous scandals involving allegations of referees being bribed or threatened. Just last year, it was revealed that a 5-year investigation by the Turkish Football Federation found that 371 of 571 match officials in Turkey had betting accounts, with 152 of those actively gambling. It is the most recent of numerous large scandals involving match fixing by referees. But the sport is also subject to simply bad calls. Some notorious examples have referees missing scores and passes made with the players' hands, challenging that claim that the game is a true game of football. Significant games have turned on calls regarding goals that seem to have been obviously wrong. While those are going to be a part of any sport, some critics point to the way that the game appoints referees, with sports writer John Doyle quoted on the radio station The World in 2014 that FIFA insists on having not the elite referees of the world, but a representative group of referees. That is, referees from all the regions in the world where soccer is played. You can have referees who have never handled a truly big game like a World Cup. In America, as the game of baseball developed, umpires were originally volunteers, usually provided by the home team. It would be local people of standing. According to Major League Baseball, umpires were not professionalized until the National League of Professional Baseball Clubs was organized in 1876. According to the league, the first professional umpire was William McLean from Philadelphia, who umpired the first game in National League history between Boston and Philadelphia on April 22nd of that year. 2 years later, the league mandated that umpires be paid $5 a game. And in 1879, National League President William A. Holbert appointed a group of 20 men from which teams could choose an umpire, therefore becoming baseball's first umpiring staff. Perhaps the greatest umpiring scandal of that game came in 1882 when umpire and former player Dick Hyam was found to be colluding with gamblers. He was investigated by a private detective after the owner of the Detroit Wolverines became suspicious of some of his game calls. He was banned for life from baseball. But professional umpires can still make mistakes, and several sports sites are happy to list some of the worst, some of which affected championship series. Some border on ridiculous, such as in Game 1 of the 1996 American League Championship Series between the Yankees and the Orioles, when umpire Rich Garcia somehow failed to notice that a 12-year-old Yankee fan had reached several feet over the fence to grab a fly ball. Rather than calling the batter out, Garcia called it a home run, allowing the Yankees to tie the game. While the first professional basketball league was established in 1898 and the National Basketball Association was founded in 1949, the league didn't have a professional organization for referees until 1973. Previously, referees were paid per game. Moreover, the league didn't move to using 3 referees per game until the 1988-89 season, long after college and high school leagues. Still, even with 3 referees, even championship games have turned on dubious calls or non-calls. The league was rocked in 2007 when it was revealed that referee Tim Donaghy was betting on games that he officiated, that he made calls to influence the point spread during the 2003-04 and 2006-07 seasons. Donaghy was sentenced to 15 months in prison. After serving his sentence, he went on to referee professional wrestling, which says a lot about that sport. In the other game of football, the National Football League writes on its website that undertrained, ill-equipped, and loosely supervised, the officials contributed to the sluggish, low-scoring, rough-and-tumble games the NFL produced in its infancy. The league took significant steps, assigning officials to specific positions in 1938 and eventually moving to a 7-person officiating crew. While the league has avoided the large referee bribery scandals that have rocked other professional sports, the league suffers from issues of consistency. While the league does weekly reviews and claims that its officials are accurate on 98.9% of calls, that perception is clearly not shared by fans if you simply watch the sports pages this morning. In response to fan complaints, in 1986, the league instituted the inclusion of instant replay, using television to advise on certain calls, but the rule was suspended in 1991 over concerns that it was delaying the game, only to be reinstituted with different rules in 1999. Of course, referee scandals aren't limited to professional sport. There have been numerous officiating scandals at the Olympics. In 1920, the final of football, and yes, Americans, by that they mean soccer, ended when the team from Czechoslovakia walked off the pitch to protest a referee's decision, giving the win to Belgium. In 1972, confusing clock management by referees resulted in the last 3 seconds of the basketball final being played 3 times, leading to a controversial 1-point win by the Soviet Union over the United States. In 2016, the authority governing amateur boxing admitted significant errors by officials in a match-fixing scandal at the Olympics in Rio. An independent investigation of the organization found systematic issues, but the results have yet to be overturned. The organization was banned from organizing competitions in the 2020 Games and has since undergone numerous reforms. New technologies have altered refereeing. The first use of photo finish to determine the result of a horse race was in 1881. Since then, numerous sports have developed review systems using television, photo, and computer assistance, including cricket's comically named Snickometer, or Snicko, which uses sensitive microphones and oscilloscopes to detect faint sounds of the ball hitting the bat, glove, or pad. Starting in the 2026 season, Major League Baseball will fully implement an auto photo strike system called the Automated Ball Strike System, or ABS. And fan feelings have engendered more than water cooler talk about refereeing. There have been several examples of rioting and violence following controversial calls by sports officials. A riot in Sydney over a call in a cricket match against England in 1879 briefly pushed Bush bandit Ned Kelly out of the headlines. In 1963, a controversial ruling following a mid-race crash resulted in harness racing fans in Long Island rioting, attacking the judge's booth, fighting with police, and setting fires. In 2001, referees reversing a call resulted in Cleveland Browns fans at Cleveland Stadium throwing plastic beer bottles onto the field, forcing the teams to leave for safety. The chaotic event was called Bottlegate by the press. Rioting after a controversial goal in a 2007 match between Catania and Palermo resulted in the death of a police officer in Italy. And referees have faced violence and attempts at intimidation. There are at least 4 instances since 2013 of soccer referees being killed by angry fans or players. Verbal abuse of officials has grown in the internet age and is cited as a main reason of professional burnout among referees at all levels of sport, ironically leading to less experienced officiating. While there's a long-held belief that referees tend to be biased towards the home team because of the energy of the crowd, recent research has called that conclusion into question. And despite all the complaints, external review tends to show that modern referees in modern sports tend to be highly accurate, although so many calls have to be made that there will always be missed or questionable calls. I certainly don't know anybody that I know that is an NFL fan who's going to agree with the league's argument that their referees are correct upon review some 99% of the time. Heck, in a 1998 televised Thanksgiving game between the Steelers and the Lions, the referee even messed up the coin toss. The fact is that if you are a long-term fan of any team in any sport, you'll remember at least one game where your team was cheated by a bad call. Some of those arguments go on for decades. But part of the reason has to do with the psychology of being a fan. We tend to be invested in the teams, and that means that we are subject to what psychologists call confirmation bias, which in brief means that no matter who you are, no matter what your team, and no matter what the sport, the referees are always going to be biased against your team. And I think it's doubtful that adding photo replays is really going to change that perception, because after all, what fun would sport be if we couldn't argue about it the next day? I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.